I'm Lauren Horn, creator of This Is Not a Sketchbook and art educator for almost 10 years, and today we're going to be setting up your final project for your ink and line unit. If you've stumbled across this video, make sure you go back and watch this one here, which is all the prep work and practice that we did to get to this point. We mentioned it in the last video, so I'm going to quickly go over some materials that you're going to need. The first is Bristol paper, if you can find it. Bristol paper is a heavyweight paper with a really smooth surface, so it's great for this current project that we're doing. You also need illustration pens in a varying weight, preferably if you can find them with archival ink, which is a waterproof ink. You also can use illustration markers in grayscale. If you can't find those, they are an optional material, but they really pack a punch and they will make your project go a little bit faster in the end. We are going to be using the grid method for this project, so you can reference back to the grid method here. I'm going to be going over those parts kind of quickly. We are doing it in a little different way today, so make sure you don't fast forward over that part when we set up. For the grid method, you're going to need a ruler, a pencil, an eraser, and it's helpful to have 2 different colored pencils for your value mapping. The last thing that you need is a really great reference photo to work from. If you have the chance to go back and review my reference photo presentation, it's going to show you a little bit more in depth of what we're looking for. But here are the key things. You want to look for value shapes, and you want to make sure that you have a variety of different types of shades in your drawing. This is going to help it make look more three-dimensional, whereas professional photography that uses too much light and kind of washes out the shapes that we're looking at ends up being really hard to draw, which is why my presentation is called Doomed from the Start. If you start with a bad reference photo, you're going to be fighting against it the whole time. Ideally, you also want to take the photo yourself. You really can't necessarily claim originality unless you had a hand in creation from the very beginning to the very end, including taking your own reference photo. So one that you've taken or one that you've directed someone to take is the best option. You of course want to make sure that it's a really clear image, that it's not something that has blurred edges unless that's intentional, or something that's been cropped down from a larger image and lost quality. You also need to make sure that your photograph has a clear sense of space, or that the objects fill up the whole frame. When I say space, I mean that we have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and that's something we're going to talk about a lot in the next unit. But for today, just make sure that you're not doing an object that's floating in space with nothing going on around it. My only advice to give you is really think twice before drawing your pets. People want to draw full body pictures of their pets, and you have to think with this project, every little hair texture you are going to have to draw. And by the end of it, I have students who want to give up or end up hating looking at their pet, and I don't want to do that to you and your pets. Lastly, you need to make sure that these photos are printed out for you so that you can physically draw on top of them, which is how we're going to be doing the grid method. When you print this photo, we are going to be using the grid method this time a little differently than we did before to enlarge our photograph. So tell your teacher you're going to print it around 70% or 80%. So this is how my picture would have printed full page. This is how I'm actually going to work from it. You want it a little bit smaller. Of course, this depends a little bit on your Bristol paper that you're using too. I'm not using a huge piece of Bristol because I want to make sure it fits on camera, but I do think these drawings are incredible done a little larger. You also might want to think about the time constraints that you have here. This is the reference photo I ended up deciding to use. It's a special moment in our life. This is when we brought our 3rd son home from the hospital, and it's the reaction of his older brothers. I thought it was really cute, but outside of that, it also has really great value shapes that you can see. There's lots of definition to show form within their faces. It also has really good contrast, meaning that we have a really dark and we have really light lights as well. I like the overall composition. I'm not going to be doing a ton of detail in the background, so it's going to make the focus on the subject matter just a little bit more. We are going to be enlarging our photo from a 1-inch grid to either a 1.5 or a 2-inch gridded paper. But for now, what I want you to do is just go ahead and give your photograph a 1-inch grid, just like we did in the gridding video. Remember, if you struggle with this, I do have a support document online called the Gridding Cheat Sheet, where you can tape that to a window, put your photograph over top, and you can use that to get your lines without actually measuring with the ruler. For now, I'm going to time lapse this part since you've seen me do it before. My first step is going to be my value mapping. So I'm going to outline all the different value shapes in a colored pencil. Then I'm going to go back and do a 1-inch grid with a different colored pencil on top of my drawing reference. Before you move ahead and set up your drawing paper, we are going to be doing that step a little bit differently for this project, so make sure you pause it there. Now we're going to move on to our Bristol paper. The difference here is that we're actually using the grid method to enlarge a photo. So instead of making a mark at every 1 inch, now you're going to make a mark at every 1.5 or every 2, depending on your size of paper. Again, I love a big drawing for this one. I really encourage you to go large if you have the time and supplies to do it. My paper needed to be a little bit more medium because I needed to make sure that it was shown well on camera. Of course, remember that a square is a square is a square, so as long as you have the same amount of boxes, the size doesn't really matter. After counting the amount of inches that I have on my reference photo, I do realize, but just barely, but I do have enough room to go ahead and do a 2-inch grid on the Bristol paper. So I'm going to set that up now. It's the same thing that we just did with gridding, except you're going to skip an inch between. Just remember, if you're moving to a 1.5-inch grid because your paper is not quite as large, you just make a mark every 1.5 inches. Typically with my students, I just go ahead and grid the entire paper. I find it's a little bit easier to just give you more boxes than you need and then erase down to what you do. So that's what I'm going to do here. Remember that with the grid method, there is a ton of erasing. So make sure that your pencil lines are really, really light here. They will all be erased by the time we're done with this project. So instead of making a mark at every inch, I'm going to skip my first inch and make a little mark at the 2. Remember that not all rulers measure from the very edge of the ruler itself. Some have a little extra room right there before you start measuring. So just make sure that you put the end of the first inch on the edge of the paper, not necessarily the edge of the ruler. So there's my mark on my 2. I'm going to skip my 3 and mark 4. Making sure my ruler stays the same the whole time and I'm just moving my hand. Again, if you need a refresher for the grid method, go back and watch my grid method video. And now remember, it's just somewhere at the top and I'm going to do it somewhere at the bottom now. We're going to flip the paper around and we're going to do the same thing on the other side, measuring every 2 inches rather than every 1. Somewhere at the top, somewhere at the bottom, nowhere specific, just trying to sort of anchor that line. Notice that I have an extra 1/2 inch here. That's totally okay. Now that I have finished gridding my photograph, value mapping my photograph, and moving my grid over to my drawing space, before I start, I want to double check that I have the right amount of squares and that I am taking any of the excess paper and sort of marking it off to the side. I wouldn't cut it off because having a border is a really nice place for you to go and kind of test your pins out on the side. It also makes matting artwork a lot easier to have a little bit of extra room right there. So if I count my boxes across here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to count over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I do have a little bit of drawing that goes into the 7th box, so I went ahead and gave me some space to do that. Right here, gave myself, sorry. And then I'm going to count to make sure I have the same amount down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It just so happened, I got lucky that I have a 1/2 inch right here, and I happen to have a 1/2 inch right here as well. So I will be able to kind of fill that in. But don't feel like you have to make it perfect boxes. If you had this extra bit on your drawing and you wanted to say, okay, I just don't want to draw that part, then just don't draw that part. I would take a marker or something and kind of wiggle that out and know that you're going to end at the perfect line right here. Now we're ready to start transferring our value map over to our drawing paper, but we're using bigger squares this time. And this is what I want you to remember, is that these are exactly like stamp squares. The ratio is what matters, not necessarily the size. And this is what I mean by that. This white line comes out about 1/3 of the way of the side. It's also going to be 1/3 of the way here. So if I divide this into thirds, that white mark is going to be about right here. Now the white mark exits the cube or the square right a little bit above halfway. So I'm going to look at this line, I'm going to find the halfway mark, and I'm going to find a little bit above it. And then I can tell myself that the white line is going to go about here. I'm going to go ahead and continue this square. So looking at where Jack's head is, it's a little bit above the halfway mark. I'm going to say it's about right here. This is about 1/3 of the way down this line, so I can kind of connect those. Now I'm going to look at where his head exits, and it's less than halfway, and enters, which is right above that line, or kind of touches that line. And this kind of edge of the couch comes out about here. So even though the square over here is larger and the square over here is smaller, as long as I am using the same ratio, it's going to transfer just fine. And this is a great way to accurately size up or size down a drawing. Using that same technique, I'm going to continue transferring my value map from my drawing reference over to my drawing surface. Make sure you really take your time with this. Of course, you're going to be looking at a time-lapse version for me, but the more time you spend here and the more careful you are, the easier it's going to be to apply the pen and the marker. If you're just going to be working with pen today, you can leave all of the pencil marks, including the grid lines, until you're completely finished with your project, because you can erase those out once your ink is dry. If you are using the marker, you need to take some time now and erase out your grid marks and lighten up your pencil line. Remember that once you marker over top of a pencil line, it is really sealed in its place, and it would be very hard to erase it without messing up your marker. Typically, my approach with these drawings is to use the darkest values first in order to sort of anchor the drawing and then work my way up to the lightest value, which should be the white of the paper. Remember, if you're working with marker, then you need to leave the white of the paper bare. You can't go back and lighten up any areas, so you need to treat it sort of like watercolor and preserve the white of the paper. I'm always keeping my reference very close by to make sure that I'm using that as a guide for where I should be pushing value or making sure areas are really clear to maintain my sense of space. This project is very time consuming, but I promise it's going to be worth it in the end if you can have the patience to really slow down and pay attention to your mark making sure that you are in control of your value. You are going to end up with a stunning artwork. So really just take your time, move slow, and you're going to love it. I would absolutely love to see your final projects. The hardest thing about teaching online is that I don't get to see my students' work, so please tag me at Lauren Horn Art or at thisisnotasketchbook.com. Our next project, we're actually not going to be using the grid method. We are going to be using a dry medium, and we are going to be working in color. So if you are bogged down by the tediousness of this project, I have the perfect one for you next. To know when it's released, follow me on all of my socials and make sure you subscribe to me right here. Thank you for doing my ink and line project with me today. I had a lot of fun doing this. I always love the result of these projects. Remember, if you're a teacher wanting to do this in your classroom, I have a ton of resources for you at thisisnotasketchbook.com. If you're someone who's just wanting to draw, I do have an art course called This Is Not a Sketchbook. It's a workbook style sketchbook complete with QR codes that lead to video lessons, kind of like this one, that will help you take my class.